What do you make of the developments we have seen overnight and indeed this afternoon?
Good afternoon to viewers. They're pretty stunning and pretty remarkable, and probably fatal in the long term and maybe even in the short term for Putin. Rather than predict, I think it's better if we ask questions. And the critical question is, are there Russian soldiers willing to fire on the Wagner mercenary group run by KILL Prigozhin? If there aren't, Putin is finished. Putin needs to find people who are willing to kill Prigozhin, or at least bring down an airstrike on him. Otherwise, Putin himself is finished. And the fact that Prigozhin has been able to walk into the Southern Military District HQ in Rostov-on-Don is a very bad sign.
Have you been surprised that it seems to be so easy for them to literally walk into Russian-controlled areas and boast that they are planning to march on Moscow, which is 1,000 miles from where they currently are?
Voronezh is nearer, and I think one of the reasons, I'm guessing slightly here, one of the reasons that I think the Russians are hitting the official, so the Russian military are hitting the fuel bases, is to make sure that Wagner find it difficult to get the fuel to get to Moscow. So clearly they're trying to restrict his ability to launch a coup in the capital. This is an uprising. Clearly he wants to launch a coup, but that coup hasn't yet happened because they can't get to Moscow, or they're not in Moscow yet. So I do think it is remarkable, and it shows that actually, look, Wagner is made up of criminals and ex-special forces. They're used to killing people. Some of them are pretty well trained, others are very badly trained, but are violent. So and because they took Bakhmut quite recently in a high-profile but fundamentally pointless battle, it did earn them credibility and a very high profile within the Russian military blogger world, but also in the Russian armed forces, especially because Prigozhin is such a high-profile figure himself. So it may be that there aren't that many people willing to take him on.
Bob, you actually are, you've served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. So what do you think of the military strategy behind what is happening?
Well, you've got a failure of unity of command, which is pretty fatal. There's two things. Firstly, you've got a failure of military command. So the fact that Wagner and Prigozhin can do their own thing within a war is potentially disastrous for a unified war effort, because you're always going to be arguing over resources and logistics. And because Prigozhin is a very political figure, he's going to be using that to attack the Russian senior figures in the Russian military defense. So he's been attacking the defense minister Shoigu, and he's been attacking the chief of the Russian general staff, Valery Gerasimov. And to be undermining unity of command when you're in a pretty desperate war is a very bad thing to do. The critical question, though, is to what extent this is going to undermine Russian morale. It's not impossible that the collapse in political stability in Russia is going to have a massive effect on the willingness of Russians to fight and die in the front lines. And if they feel no longer that there's any point in them being there and that the control over them is breaking down, look out for Russian troops deserting in larger numbers, look out for Russian troops killing their own officers, look out for Russian troops surrendering in larger numbers. It's not impossible this will lead to a collapse in either the southern or eastern fronts. And that probably is the most immediate thing that the Ukrainians are going to be thinking about, to what extent their offensives are going to be so much more, to what extent this will raise the morale of Ukrainian soldiers, and to what extent this will sink and collapse the morale of Russian soldiers. And if we're back into a World War I type scenario, where political collapse in Russia heralds military collapse at the front line.
It's a mess. Talking of the political side of things, we're hearing that Rishi Sunak is having meetings with these G7 counterparts. What does it mean politically for the United Kingdom?
That Russia is dangerous and unstable and nuclear armed. It all depends what happens in the war. Is this going to, as I say, herald a Russian collapse? I don't think there's going to be immediate external threat from Russia, because I think they're now too busy sorting out internal power. But clearly, we're going to want to know what's happening. The questions that I guess that I think Rishi is probably asking is, what does this mean for control of Russian nukes? Probably nothing, we hope. Is Putin likely to be ousted, or is Putin going to be able to kill Prigozhin? If Putin kills Prigozhin, Wagner are finished, because without Prigozhin, there is no Wagner. So somebody has to kill Prigozhin for Putin, because these two men cannot now survive. There's a small chance that they can patch things up, but realistically, considering the high-profile speech made by Putin, they're calling him now openly a traitor, the FSB, the Russian security agency, bringing a case against him. Fundamentally, one of them is going to end up in a bad situation. Either Putin's out or Prigozhin is going to be killed and effectively won't even reach trial. But I mean, for Putin, once you're a dictator, once your power is openly challenged, it's a matter of time now before the Russian regime collapses. Whether it's 5 days, 5 weeks, or 5 months, Putin is pretty much finished.